This is Dr. Jenkins. Here we go. This time we'll be talking about the urinary system. And of course, when we talk about the urinary system, we absolutely have to talk about fluid balance. So there's kind of two parts to this chapter: the urinary system anatomy and how the kidneys work, and then how the kidneys help to maintain fluid balance, pH balance of the blood in the body. This is one of my favorite cartoons. Hello, Incontinence Helpline, can you hold? You know, I gotta make myself laugh sometimes. All right, I hope that you'll enjoy this chapter. I think it's kind of fun. We'll see what happens when you go through it. So as I said, we're going to talk about the kidneys, the anatomy of the urinary system, and then talk about how the kidneys work and how they form urine. And then the second part is all about fluid balance. So here we go. The beginning is pretty straightforward: the urinary system. The urinary system is composed of these organs. Everyone knows the kidneys. They're kind of the stars of the show, I suppose. We have two kidneys. You can see the one on the left side is a little bit higher than the one on the right. We have ureters. The ureters are what? Let me just do, I think white will be good. The ureters are what transport urine from the kidneys down. And of course, the ureters will lead to the holding tank for the urine, which is the bladder. And then when we're ready, we release the urine out through the urethra, which, as we'll find, is structured differently in a male versus a female. Okay, the functions of the urinary system overall. The urinary system functions to filter the blood. That's the kidneys, right? So we've talked about other parts of the body that filter the blood, because the spleen can filter the blood. We talked about that in the lymphatic system and the immune system. The liver filters the blood. We talked about that in the digestive system. And here we see again another organ that filters the blood. So the blood is filtered again and again and again. And each particular organ that filters the blood has a specific thing that it's really filtering for. So as we'll see for the kidneys are really good at filtering out excess glucose. The kidneys are really good at filtering out excess hydrogen ions, creatinine, urea, all these sorts of things. And then whatever the kidneys filter out of the blood, which is considered to be a waste product, well, those waste products are excreted through the urine. So these two functions go hand in hand. The kidneys filter the blood, and then from that, they collect the waste products, and it can be excreted from the body through urine. But this is the function that maybe isn't talked about as much, but is really, 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 let me say it again, really, really important. The kidneys have a huge role in homeostasis. So this includes fluid balance, pH balance, fluid balance in terms of overall volume, but also the amount of water and salt. I mean, homeostasis of everything. Because the kidneys form the urine, the kidneys have the ability to excrete more or less through urine. And because of that, can maintain fluid balance and a whole bunch of balance of other things. So this is maybe a function that people don't think about as much, but it is oh so important. There is another function of the kidneys that we're not going to talk about. The kidney itself releases a hormone called renin, which does play a role because renin goes to the red bone marrow in the ends of long bones, and renin triggers the bone marrow to produce blood cells. That's really important. I'm sorry. Take that back. I apologize. Erythropoietin is the hormone that does that. I don't know where my brain is right now. Erythropoietin is the hormone that stimulates red blood cell production in the bones. Renin is another hormone. Renin plays a role in blood volume and blood pressure regulation. But you don't need to know these. I'm just letting you know that the kidneys do something else as well. They produce two hormones. All right. So this is going to be the part on anatomy. And we're going to spend most of our time talking about the kidneys. The kidneys are the star of the show. This is where we filter the blood. This is where we produce urine. Everything else is basically a transport or storage vesicle. All right, so a lot of this I believe to be straightforward, but there is quite a lot of terminology, so make sure you spend enough time with it. The kidney itself is divided into this outer rim, and this outer rim that I have in white is called the renal cortex, because cortex means outer, just like we had a cerebral cortex. And then the inner part, between the brackets there, is called the renal medulla. Same here, the inner part is the renal medulla. So they're regions. Inside the renal medulla, we have these triangular shaped structures called renal pyramids. So each one of these is a renal pyramid. The top picture of the kidney has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 renal pyramids. Down here, this is a real kidney. We have 1, 2, 3 that we can see, 4, 5, 6. So sometimes we'll have more, maybe 6 to 8 renal pyramids, triangular shaped or pyramid shaped structures in the renal medulla. I'm going to move pretty quickly because this is straightforward. So I just wanted to point out, you don't have to know the specific blood vessels. So this picture of the kidney is showing you all the specific blood vessels. You don't need to know all of them. If you're interested, of course, the renal artery and vein will supply and drain from the kidney as a whole. But then we have all these branches, segmental, interlobar, interlobular, arcuate, all these segments. Which means altogether, the kidney receives a lot of blood. That's what I want to point out. The kidneys receive a lot of blood. You can see up top here, I'm not going to ask you this number, but I think it's interesting. At rest. This corresponds to at rest. At rest, the kidneys receive about 25% of our cardiac output, or the blood that's pumping out of our heart. 25%! 25%, that's crazy. It's a quarter of all the blood at rest goes to the kidneys, because at rest, we're not really contracting our skeletal muscles. This is the time when you're at rest. This is the time to filter the blood at the kidneys. I would like you to know the major vessels. So you don't need to know the smaller ones, but you do need to know we have the renal artery, brings blood into the kidney, and the renal vein, which carries blood out of the kidney. This is where it gets fun. Here we go. All right, so we already established that the renal cortex is this outer rim. If we were to look at this outer rim and we were to magnify it, here we have the outer rim, right? So we're still talking about this outer rim. It is made up of many, millions of nephrons. So the renal cortex is just packed with these microscopic units called nephrons. These microscopic units that are stuffed into the renal cortex are really important. The nephrons are what filters the blood. The nephrons are what filters out the bad, keeps the good, and therefore forms the urine. So really, really important. There are over 1 million nephrons per kidney. Really, really important. Now, if we look up close at the nephron, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, the nephron includes this ball at the beginning, and then it includes all these tubules that are kind of in a yellowish beige color. So it's kind of a funny structure, but each nephron has this ball, which is right here, and then leading off of it are all these tubules. The whole thing collectively is known as a nephron. And they are just packed tightly into the renal cortex. So now if we enlarge that and we just take a look at one nephron, that ball structure I was talking about is called the glomerulus, because inside this ball is a collection of capillaries. And that's what the glomerulus really is. It's a ball of capillaries. Then we have a whole bunch of tubules, and each part of the tubule has a name. What we're going to find out is these tubules, the fluid is traveling in one direction only. These are one-way streets. So the first tubules, after leaving that ball, or the collection of capillaries called the glomerulus, the first tubules are the proximal convoluted tubules. I just put that in pink. Then we have the loop of Henle, or the loop of nephron. I put that in green. Then we have the distal convoluted tubule. I put that in white. And lastly, we have the collecting duct, where all the other nephrons empty into. So these go in order of how the filtrate, or the fluid, flows through it. The initial ball is the glomerulus, or a collection of capillaries, leads to our first series of windy structures called the proximal convoluted tubule. Then it leads to the loop of Henle, or nephron. Then it leads to a distal series of convoluted tubules. And then everything dumps into the collecting duct. Okay, here it is again. Same thing, I just gave it to you twice. So make sure you know these basic parts of the nephron. And here it is again. So I'm trying to give you as clear of pictures as possible. We have the glomerulus, ball of capillaries, the proximal convoluted tubule, the first series of windy tubes, the loop of Henle, or loop of nephron, and then we have the distal convoluted tubule, which leads into the collecting duct. Distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct. If we look more up close at the glomerulus, remember the glomerulus is a collection of capillaries. So inside, these things are all capillaries, which means a lot of surface area. It's going to lead into the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, that isn't the whole picture. So now that we've established what a nephron looks like, the nephrons, they're not by themselves. Surrounding the nephrons are blood vessels, arteries, and veins. So now if we take the whole picture, and let's just get our bearings here, from here up is the windy line. Here up is the renal cortex, the outer rim, and then we start to get into the renal medulla down here. Well, as I said, most of the nephrons, almost all of them, are housed in the renal cortex. There they are, the ball in the center, the glomerulus, which leads into proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, or loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, and collecting duct. But check it out. There are blood vessels around it. Yeah. So we've got arteries and veins. So here showing some arteries, the blue. Here showing some veins, the red. So there's arteries and veins and even capillaries surrounding the tubules. I'd like you to know that the particular name for the capillary bed that surrounds the tubules is called the peritubular capillaries, which I think makes perfect sense. Peri means around. So these are the peritubular capillaries. Capillaries around the tubules. If you're wondering, FYI, we do have an afferent arteriole that feeds the glomerulus, right? So what's going to bring blood into the glomerulus is called the afferent arteriole. And then what's going to bring blood out of the glomerulus is called the efferent arteriole. I'm not going to have you know those right now, but there they are, in case you're wondering. But what I would like you to know is the peritubular capillaries, capillary bed that surrounds the tubules of the nephron. Again, another picture up close. More pictures, more you can study. Now, here's what the renal cortex looks like in real life. So even though they give us these drawings that look great, it's so simple. We have the glomerulus, and then we can follow evenly everything else. Well, of course, they don't exist like this perfectly in the body. In reality, they all get smushed together. But that's okay. I just want you to be able to see, we can still see the ball of capillaries called the glomerulus. Glomeruli is plural. And then we can see some of the peritubular capillaries surrounding it. We can see the afferent arteriole going in. We can see some of the blood vessels. Okay. All right, so now that we know the basic anatomy, there's so much more I could be talking about, but really I just want to give you the basic anatomy. Well, now we can start talking about function. How do these structures work together to filter the blood and then produce urine? So, we are going to break down the steps of urine formation, which, by the way, involves filtration, right, into 4 steps. You should be familiar with, and you should know well, these 4 steps of how the kidneys, how the nephrons form urine. Number 1, glomerular filtration. So what's going to happen is blood from the body comes into the glomerulus, and the glomerulus filters it. Check that out. It's a structure that's perfectly built for filtration because the capillary membrane is very thin, so we have an easy membrane with which we can diffuse through, and capillaries have a large surface area, so we can spread out the blood, get a large surface area, do a lot of filtration, and filter pretty easily because we have a pretty thin capillary wall capable of doing a lot of diffusion through it. Now, in terms of filtration, it's pretty interesting. Here, it's not really filtering yet based off of what is useful for the body and what is waste. Eventually, we're going to get there. Eventually, that's what the kidney is going to do. It's going to separate things the body can use, and it'll reabsorb those things. And the kidney will separate out what is waste products, what are waste products. And then the kidneys will release those through urine. But at first, the filtration happens by size. Small versus large. You don't need to know necessarily which direction these are going. I just want to make the point that when the blood enters the glomerulus, it is filtered pretty much just based off of size. Smaller particles are able to diffuse through the glomerular capillary wall into the tubules. Large particles aren't, and they stay in the glomerulus and exit the glomerulus via the efferent arteriole into the peritubular capillaries. How about that? But don't worry about that. Keep it simple. The initial filtration at the kidneys in the glomerulus is done by size. And then, once we get to the tubules, so you can see what's happening and where it's happening. So glomerular filtration, the blood is being filtered, and it's occurring in the glomerulus. Then we have reabsorption and secretion. And where are these occurring? In the tubules. So here is where we separate good things from waste. If our initial filtration was just by size, well, that doesn't really have much to do with whether that small or large particle is actually good for the body and can be reused, or whether that small or large particle has to be excreted because it's waste. There are plenty of small particles that are useful things we can reabsorb, like maybe calcium, and there's plenty of small things that are bad that we have to get rid of, like excess glucose. And likewise for large. So the initial filtration is done by size in the glomerulus, but then it is in the tubules where we reabsorb good things. And we reabsorb those good things into the blood, because the blood is going to stay in the body. So wouldn't we want to reabsorb good into the blood? Versus secretion. This is where we secrete waste products into tubules, because it is the tubules that are going to go on to lead to the ureter, bladder, and can be peed out. Really important here. After the initial filtration by size, now in the tubules, we really separate the good things the body wants to keep, we reabsorb those, and we separate the waste products the body wants to get rid of. We put those into the tubules. Lastly, step number 4, this is when we get to the collecting ducts. And in the collecting ducts, this is our last chance to reabsorb water. So your body wants to reabsorb and recycle all that it can. So when possible, it reabsorbs that water. This is the basics, folks. Pause for general effect. So these next couple slides are just going through the same things that I just said. Okay? So here we have glomerular filtration step number 1. Blood comes in and it's filtered. It's filtered by size, much like a strainer. So we can bring some things in, whatever is small enough will filter out, but whatever is too big will stay. Whatever is small enough continues on to the tubules. Whatever is large stays here. Well, it's a wrong place. Hold on. Whatever is small enough stays, leaves via the efferent arteriole to go into the peritubular capillaries. And then it is once we get to the tubules. And remember, we have the tubules running right alongside the blood vessels. So this is a perfect opportunity to really make sure that we reabsorb all of the good. So reabsorption means movement of good particles into the blood. We want to keep the good things into the blood because it'll stay in the body. Most of our reabsorption happens in the proximal convoluted tubule. As an aside, most of the fluid is reabsorbed. Our body is very efficient and it likes to recycle. On the other hand, secretion is movement of waste particles into the tubules. Movement of waste particles into the tubules. Because in the tubules, this is where we're going to eventually release this as urine. And if most of this is happening in the distal convoluted tubule. There's some happening earlier, but the majority happens in the distal convoluted tubule. And lastly, our water conservation. This is our last chance to reabsorb any water. And of course, because we're talking about reabsorb, we mean into the bloodstream of water. And again, we reabsorb a lot. We reabsorb a lot because the body wants to keep it and recycle it. All right, so I've given you some animations. You have access to the actual PowerPoint where you can actually click slide by slide to see the animations. using my iPad program here, I'm not able to do the clicks. But they just review. Blood comes into the kidneys through the renal artery, spreads out through all those blood vessels. Eventually, that blood goes into the renal cortex where the nephrons are. Then we magnify to the nephron. Blood is coming into the nephron where there's filtration happening. Small things that are diffused out go into the proximal convoluted tubule. Large things leave via the efferent arteriole and end up in the bloodstream. So now we have side by side, we have the bloodstream and the tubules. And we can do reabsorption and secretion. The white arrows, I'm trying to show you absorption. We're absorbing good things into the bloodstream. The black arrows are meant to show you waste products moving into the tubules, because tubules is what's going to be released through the urine. So in essence, we've filtered what we can keep, what's good, the body reabsorbs into the blood, and then we filter out waste products that the body needs to get rid of. Those go into the tubules. In the end, when all is said and done, whatever is left in the tubules is going to leave via the ureters into the bladder, not the urethra. And whatever is in the blood vessels gets reabsorbed back into the body. Okay, I know. You might be thinking that. We still have more to talk about? What? So what I want to do is I want to finish the rest of the urinary system, anatomy, and physiology, and then in our next video, that's when we'll talk about fluid balance. So let's just remind ourselves about the rest of the urinary anatomy. The ureters, now that we've formed urine, the ureters will transport the urine down into the bladder, holds on to the urine, and then whenever you're ready, you release the urine through the urethra. Here's an actual x-ray where they've put dye into the body, so you can see if I was to superimpose the kidneys, they'd kind of be like this. Remember, I'm not a very good drawer, but that's about where the kidneys would be. So we can see the red here is the urine leaving the kidneys. You can see why kidney stones would hurt, because these ureters are very narrow, into the storage tank or the bladder. Okay, I'm going to end this first part of the video, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about homeostasis and fluid balance.